How's it going, everybody? And welcome to episode 319 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode is covering the subject of greenhouses and how to choose the correct greenhouse for your garden. And decided to cover it kind of off the back of a few questions, a lot of questions actually, over the last couple of weeks. So, for any of you that are listening to the podcast, I've had back in February, 21st of February, I had a grow your own food workshop here in the garden, Polytunnel, and it was a brilliant day. And three of the people that were there, or three, there was a couple and two other people that were there, and they were all getting greenhouses or had just got greenhouses, and they had a lot of questions around, orientation, how to set up inside, what to grow, some questions about whether they'd made the right choice. And then I have another one, the same workshop, 21st of March, which actually only has three spaces left on it. So if anyone is interested in that, you'd want to be getting those booked. But two people who are coming on that workshop are in the process of ordering their greenhouses currently. So it seems to be a bit of a trend. And they had questions around whether they were ordering the right one and so on. And then on the Grow Your Own Food webinar, which I did last Friday night, now that was really good. 340 people signed up, 140 or so attended live. The replay has been watched a couple of hundred times. So great interest in growing your own. But on that, we did a Q&A towards the end. And during that Q&A, again, questions around what's the best type of greenhouse. I'm considering this greenhouse. What do you think? I want to put it in a certain location. What do you think? Any advice? So I suppose there's a lot of questions around it, and it is the time of year where people are, ordering and getting set up with their greenhouses. So that's the reason for covering it. Um, I suppose people are, part of the question that they're asking is they're looking for reassurance that they're making the right decision in terms of their purchase. And to be honest, I can't give you that reassurance. I'll give you guidance, what to look for and recommendations. I don't have any, I'm not affiliated to any company. I don't have any, I suppose, I don't have experience with some of them, like different types of greenhouse. I don't have personal experience of them. I know what I see. I know what, I suppose, feedback I get from people. I know what I see when I drive around because that is the type of thing I look for. I look to see greenhouses. I look to see, conditions and so on and so on. So yeah, I can give recommendations for sure, and hopefully, give you the right questions that you can ask to make sure you get to the right decision for your garden. And that is very much the crux of it. It's what's right for your garden. And there's many, many factors that you would take into account. So hopefully I'll kind of answer all of those during this. Um, just to take a slight step back, why would you get a greenhouse? Well, here in Ireland, it's not essential in terms of growing your own food, but it certainly does help a lot. We get, like for example, we can't grow tomatoes here successfully outside. Now I know there's probably people saying, "Oh, I had tomatoes this year, that year." On a consistent basis, you won't grow tomatoes outside in Ireland. Simple as that. Just not warm enough, just not dry enough. Um, you will get occasions where you'll be lucky enough. You will get years where you're lucky enough. But on a consistent basis, it's nigh on impossible to grow consistently year after year without a greenhouse, certain crops. So the likes of peppers, tomatoes, and so on. So basically, a greenhouse extends your possibilities in terms of what you can grow and gives guarantee or surety around what you can grow. Again, like I say, you could get lucky on a certain year and be able to grow tomatoes outside, but for the most part, you will definitely grow them every year successfully in a greenhouse. So that it gives you that. It gives you an extension at both ends of the year as well. I think this is really an important one. So earlier in the spring, if you have your planning done right and your autumn planting done right, you can get crops pretty much all winter in your greenhouse. And certainly when it comes to spring, you're able to get up and running way, way quicker. So it gives you that extension at the start of the year. And then at the opposite end of the year, the very, very same thing, you'll be harvesting even your tomatoes right up until October, November here. And the likes of the leaves, salad leaves you'll have all along. So it gives you extensions at both ends of the year, and that's really vital. In terms of, sowing seeds at this time of the year, it gives you such an advantage over somebody who's just going to sow directly into the ground. You just have a big advantage. Now, as I say, it isn't impossible to grow vegetables without them. Of course, you can do that, but it just gives you these big extensions on either end of the season, and that's quite important. So they're the reasons it extends your season, gives you greater variety and range of crops that you can grow, um, and you can get started a lot earlier in the springtime, and that's kind of the reasons for having it. Other things to factor in, it's a lovely place to sit, so factor that in if you are buying or considering buying. Factor in a spot where you can sit and have your cup of coffee. It can become a lovely, lovely space. You can go out there and sit on a day where it might be cold, but you have a little bit of sunshine. It'll be quite snug in there, quite relaxing in there. On a wet day when it's raining, you'll have something to be pottering at. Even somewhere to dry your clothes on certain days as well. So there's loads of possibilities, and it's a nice space when you plan for it at the start. And and when I say plan for it at the start, really what we're talking about is getting something big enough to be able to serve multiple functions for you. So I'll come to that in a minute. The other thing in terms of positioning, and it's a question that I get asked a lot, is where to position and does orientation of your greenhouse matter? And I suppose two parts to this. From a positioning perspective, get it as close as you possibly can to your house or as close as makes sense to your house. Make it quite accessible because you'll end up growing things in there. Like, for example, in my greenhouse, I have all the herbs, the herbs that we use on a pretty much on a daily basis, if not every second day. So it's so easy with a little pat to just run out there, you don't have to, you could have your slippers on, just run out, grab your few little bits of herbs and back in. So accessibility is a key thing. Make it easy to get to. Don't put it so far away that it's a challenge to get to it. Now, obviously, you take aesthetics and your garden layout and all that into account, but the closer you can get it to your usable kitchen space, the better. It just makes it easier for running out and grabbing your crops when they are up and running. The positioning of it in terms of orientation. Now, there is a recommendation to run it north south. So in other words, on the longest part or the ridge bar or whatever you want to call it of that greenhouse runs north to south. And that's a kind of a recommendation, a kind of a universal recommendation as to the orientation of it. Now, I personally don't think that makes a whole pile of a difference. Obviously, the bigger factor is to put it somewhere where it's going to capture as much sun as possible. So obviously it's a greenhouse. It's allows light through on all angles, all sides. Hence the reason I'm saying I don't think it's overly vital that it's positioned or angled in a certain or orientated in a certain direction. I think more important is that wherever you put it, it's able to access as much of the sun as it, goes around your property or whatever, um, over the course of the day. And by that I mean there's no point in sticking it somewhere where the morning sun is going to be shut off by, high trees, and the evening sun is going to be cut off by a shed, and the daytime sun is going to be cut off by your house. Do you know what I mean? So position it where you would get the most capture of sun, you know, as possible. That's typically also where you position things like your seating areas outside, your patios or your coffee areas. For me here, I've kind of two areas like that because the sun moves around the house and you capture the morning sun in one spot, which is, perfect for your morning coffee or whatever. But then as the sun goes around in the evening time, it just hits one spot. So kind of have two areas for that. And where I position the greenhouse, it's slightly not capturing the very late sun, but it gets it from very first thing in the morning all the way through noon up into afternoon, definitely into early evening, and it's just that kind of late evening sun that doesn't quite hit it. So I'm trying to maximize as much light as I possibly can on it, and that's a big factor. And then the other factor is when you do have your greenhouse, make sure you keep it clean because you cannot overestimate how much light a dirty roof or glazing or polythene will block out. And it makes a significant difference to your growing of your crops. So just make sure that you are keeping that clean and it will allow lots of light through. And that's a really important factor. But that is after you have it in place. So put it somewhere where it makes sense in terms of accessibility and where it's able to capture as much sun as possible. And don't worry too much about your orientation other than that. The only other thing that you need to factor in certain parts, not everywhere, is wind. And if you're on a very exposed site, well, then positioning it in a sheltered spot may be a better option than sticking it in the most exposed spot, but picking up full sun because we're getting quite a few storms here over the last number of years, and putting it in a sunny spot that's going to be fully exposed on a stormy day just doesn't make sense. The potential loss is a lot higher than the gain of putting it into the sunniest spot on your garden. So that's the only other thing I would factor in is exposure to wind. And in certain places, you will need to put that into, if you're in a very exposed site that typically in the area has been getting bombarded with any of these storms that we've had over the last number of years, then your number one priority is to put that into a place that's as sheltered as possible. And the light aspect is a sort of becomes a secondary consideration on a site like that. So with that in mind, then they're the kind of basics that you need to consider for yourself in your garden. And then after that, it's which type of greenhouse. And I suppose no matter what greenhouse we go to talk about here, the overriding advice I would give, and as I say, I can't give advice on specific brands or companies necessarily because I don't have huge experience of them. I can only just tell you what people tell me or what I see in relation to them. But my general advice is try not to skimp or try not to budget on your greenhouse because it is a longer term investment in terms of a good quality structure that you are spending the money on is definitely going to last you a long time. So don't skimp at this stage. And what I mean by that is you can go on in the morning and you can buy, for example, a 6x8 polycarbonate greenhouse on the likes of, Temu or somewhere for 200 or 300 euro. And it looks, for the size, it looks extremely good value. The first thing I'll tell you is that your head will be melted by the time you have it put together. They're difficult, they're tricky. Um, but the bigger thing is that at that sort of lower level of budget, you just don't really have any surety. And I think you're better off, if budget is tight, I would sit tight for another year, gather up another few quid, and then go that little bit higher. So get the best quality that you can possibly get at that time, whichever type it is, because the quality and the money that you spend will repay you 100-fold over the next 10 years, 15 years. And if you go low budget and as a result lesser quality, the first storm will just take it away. And while it might have cost you whatever amount less, your longevity is just not there. And that would be my one thing is get as good a quality one as you possibly can. Now, as I say, I don't know your budget. You know, you can buy any level of product, but just consider that it's not money well spent if it blows away in the first storm. So, factor that in. When it comes to what types are out there, essentially it boils down to, and I have kind of covered this episode before, and it's a good few years ago. And at the time, you're talking about glass house and you're talking about polytunnels, and polycarbonate houses were, I won't say coming on the market because they were already on the market, but the newer types of full sheet polycarbonate houses were kind of newish to the market. And personally, I didn't see that there was any history of them prior to that. Now, that episode was 5 years ago, I would say now at this stage. It was probably sometime in the early COVID days. There was a multitude of greenhouses put up all over the country since then, and a lot of them have been these polycarb, big sheet polycarb houses. And they seem to, again, if you're getting the better branded ones or the better budget, the higher budget ones, they seem to be lasting extremely well and standing up to these storms. So it's I suppose there's more time has passed since, so there's more evidence that they can survive. So again, the three that we're considering are glasshouse, polytunnel, and polycarbonate. Um, when it comes to glass houses, I think aesthetically they are going to be, the nicest looking houses that you're going to get. There's something really beautiful about a nice glass house. There is again within that you have, within the retail market, you have your kind of your standard budget houses. Not necessarily budget, but you have your entry level houses, let's call them. And there's a multitude of those out there. I won't name brands necessarily, but there's a lot of glass houses out there. And they look good. They're generally glass houses will be a little bit warmer than polytunnels particularly. Um, so you're able to keep them warmer a lot easier. You can put a bit of heat in there. They are able to retain the heat a little bit better. And aesthetically a lot more beautiful. They're in terms of costings, they're probably per meter squared. They're probably more expensive. Not probably, they are more expensive than your your polytunnel or polycarbonate house, but they are more of a long-term piece. Frames tend to be aluminium. They generally speaking last quite well. Um, Glass is kind of options are horticultural or toughened horticultural glass basically is like standard glass that breaks in shards if it breaks. And toughened glass, which is basically safety glass, is like the windscreen of a car. When it breaks, it shatters into tiny pieces that are not sharp. And they're kind of your options. You can get polycarb panels within those as well. Um, but you can get anything from your sort of 600 euro house up to endless, beautiful teak glass houses with teak frames, the lovely red brick bases with the teak frames on top. They're just class looking brands like Gabriel Ash and so on. And everything budget from a budget perspective, everything in between then from, as I say, your three or 400, 500 euro up to whatever, depending on your size. But a glass house is a very, very good option. Um, there's a couple of good Irish companies, Landmark, uh, glass houses. They make glass houses, quite strong ones. I don't have any personal experience of them, but I know of people who have used their houses and speak very, very highly of them. So that's a good one. Um, then there's all, as I say, all the retail brands and then some higher end brands as well. So a glass house, a brilliant, brilliant option. And then you go on to polytunnels. Now, polytunnels are definitely, as I said, they're way more value per meter squared. And depending on where you put them, depending on how they're put together again, and depending on the quality of polytunnel that you buy, and it really does matter whether we're talking about glasshouse, polytunnel, or polycarbonate. The better quality that you can buy, the longer lasting they're going to be. For example, my polytunnel now got moved a number of years ago down to where I'm currently living, but previously I had it in another place, and that was covered. And on with the same covers, it was in position for about 18 years without having to change covers, without anything like that. So bulletproof, absolutely bulletproof over that period of time. And that is kind of the max you're going to get is 18 years or thereabouts. It's currently in its current position, 5 or 6 years now. And again, same thing. It's in good nick. But it is a good quality frame, very, very strong frame. And I think that's the key is to get a really, really strong frame. Make sure that if you're getting somebody to put it up, that it's put up properly because any of these houses, if there's everything is secure and nothing is loose or torn, then they can resist a lot of strong winds very, very well. So go for good quality and the best quality that you can afford. The other kind of consideration, overall consideration is whatever size you think you want, go slightly bigger because everybody says you will always fill it and you'll always find a use and a space for it. So go bigger than you possibly can. In terms of polytunnel suppliers, there's loads of them out there again. You know, you've D-Plant sells very, very good ones, makes them themselves down in Wexford. One of the heavier type, they're very, good quality. Then you have Polydome in Offaly, you have Collamore and Polythene Houses, you have Polytunnels Direct, some of these companies that I don't personally know, but they all do various offers in polytunnels. And again, just the consideration on polytunnels is if you are getting a big polytunnel, just make sure you get vented doors or you have the ability to vent them some way. That's one of the biggest mistakes is that people get a really big house and don't have any vents on it. And it becomes, the air gets stagnant inside it and it can cause diseases and so on. So you want to get as much ventilation as you possibly can into it. And that's a consideration at buying time. So there come some of the suppliers. Then polycarbonate. Everybody's talking about polycarbonate, as I say, over the last few years. When I last covered this, I felt that there wasn't enough evidence for me personally to speak on them because there was, they weren't really in the market in these big sheets. They were only starting to come into the market. But now you're kind of 5, 6 years on, huge amount of people have bought them. Again, for probably for budget reasons, they look relatively good. They are a little because they're twin walled, they're a little bit warmer than a polytunnel. They they have kind of history of being polycarbonate had a history of being quite finicky in Ireland because we get a lot of wind, but that seems to be less the case now. And if you remember back to the episode I did with Tanya from Lovely Greens, so she's on the Isle of Man, and she talked a lot about a greenhouse called I think it was a polycrub she called it. So polycrub, I wasn't quite sure what it was, and when I looked it up afterwards, it's a type of polycarbonate greenhouse that is made and developed in Scotland and made to resist the winds and the harsh weathers that they would get in parts of Scotland. So Polycrub, I think, was the name of the one that she did, and I don't know that that one is available here in Ireland, but it it looks like a really really solid, and it's a polycarbonate house. So polycarbonate is definitely a good option. There are multiple suppliers of polycarbonate. Again, I think Polytunnels Direct do polycarbonate, KSB Greenhouses do one. A very, very interesting one and nice looking one is Hectagon Houses. So they do a wooden framed greenhouse. And then the polycarbonate on it is slightly different. It's corrugated sheets of polycarbonate. And it's a nice shape, very, very solid construction, seems to be, well suited. I think they're based in the West, so it's very, very well suited to that windy conditions that you would get. And reports are, I've seen them in places that, stock us of them, and they look like a nice house. But reports are that they stand up really, really well to weather conditions. So too do certain other polycarbonate houses. They stand up really well to conditions. But again, it all boils down to whether it's a glass, polythene, or polycarbonate. You want to make sure that wherever the panels or panes or sheets are attached, make sure that that is solid, because if wind gets into it, gets under it, and gets any kind of a catch on that, then it can take the whole glass house, polytunnel, or polycarbonate house. So the key is the fitting of it, quality fittings, making sure everything is locked into position, that nothing is able to catch in the wind, nothing blows away. Uh, and then by doing that, you kind of end up in a position where you're able to resist these storms and so on. But quality, buy as much quality as you possibly can at that stage. And as I say, if you need to wait for a little bit longer, then do that. But go for as good a quality as you possibly can. The the evidence is there now that polycarbonate can be a very, very good option for people, but it does depend on, the brand and the how it was put together as well. They're huge factors, and where you position on your site. That's for you to decide, and you need to put it somewhere. If you are in a place that's exposed, get it somewhere where it's going to get the most protection possible, because there is only a certain amount that they can resist. So give them every help that you possibly can. And as I mentioned, I would consider, if you're on an exposed site, I would consider shelter from the wind the highest priority, much higher than putting it in a position where it'll get more light, because you'll get enough of light to grow your crops no matter where you put it, well, within reason. But if it blows away during the first storm, then having it in a sunny location is not the best. So they're kind of the options. Major things are the major takeaway tips to give anyone is to buy as good a quality as you possibly can. Get it into the best and securest location for your site in terms of winds, particularly. If winds are not a huge factor, get it into the sunniest spot that you possibly can. Keep it accessible for the house and kitchen. That's really important. At the stage of planning, see can you figure out a way of harvesting water off it. I think some of those houses, like all the glass houses, you can easily harvest water off it. Factor that in at day one, capture that on day one, because it'll make such a difference to the inside. Heptagon houses, I believe, as well, you can harvest the water directly from those. Again, factor that in on day one. Some of the polytunnels you can. I harvest water off my polytunnel through some kind of little bit of a redesign of how things are done. Um, but it is generally trickier to harvest rainwater from a polycarbonate house or from a polytunnel. But if you are, planning now, have a think about that and see can you capture the water in any way. So they're my tips. As I say, I'm not going to mention or recommend specific brands because I don't have personal experience of them. I can only just tell you what I've seen, and what I've seen over the last number of years is that obviously glass houses still remain probably the most aesthetically beautiful. Um, they are, when put together properly, when buying a better quality, they are a lifetime job. You may have to replace panes of glass, but that's not such a big deal. Factor in children and hurls and footballs if you have that type of a household. Um, just watch for that. Polytunnels definitely give you the most square meterage for your money spent. Go bigger than you need to. Again, whichever you're choosing, highest quality that you can possibly buy. Don't forget to factor in water collection, and in particularly in polytunnels, as much ventilation as you can possibly get in there, because you will need it, especially as you go bigger in the houses. You want to get as much ventilation as possible. Polycarbonate, yeah, the last 4 or 5 years has shown that certain models in certain places are able to resist the strongest of winds. There is a certain amount of history there now. There is a certain amount of evidence that they're good enough for the conditions here. But again, you need to pick, and don't let don't be driven by cost here. Get the best quality that you possibly can, and the better quality ones are going to repay you 100 times more than whatever that little bit of savings might be in those initial stages. So best quality that you can buy, and then you're going to get years upon years out of it, and they are much, much better value over the longer term. So I hope that kind of answers it. Yeah, it's amazing the amount of questions still on it. I know it's a relatively big purchase, but people seem to take an awful lot of time deliberating on greenhouses. I suppose for that reason, it is deemed a longer term purchase, and that's why I say if you are thinking of this in a longer term, then get the best quality you possibly can, or you could be looking at it flying down the road after the first big storm. So do factor in those things, and I hope that kind of helps and gives a little bit of guidance on it. Actually, another question that came up quite a lot on both the workshop that we did so far and the webinar last week was on the beds inside. Do I buy raised beds with the greenhouse? Because a lot of the suppliers now seem to be doing a package where they sell you the greenhouse and then also sell you raised beds to go into it. Personally, and again, this is a personal choice, I don't see any need for raised beds within a greenhouse. If you're going onto a soil or a ground situation, I would grow in the ground a lot faster than I would grow in raised beds. Just unless you have mobility issues, I wouldn't use raised beds. I don't think there's any need. You will grow better crops directly into the ground. They're easier to mind. It's easier to connect with the soil life that is there, and a lot easier to set up and a lot less expensive to set up. So I would use ground beds as much as possible there. But if you're on a hard surface and you have to use raised beds, then that makes total sense. But if you don't have to, you don't have any mobility issues, you are not on a hard surface, then I would go ground beds as opposed to raised beds. And that's something that, yeah, was asked several times at the workshop and in questions since then. So, yeah, hope that answers it. Hope that covers all that you might have to ask. As I mentioned, the workshop 30, 21st of March. There's only 3 spaces left on that. So if anyone's interested in that, you want to be getting your tickets. It's a really fun day out, actually. Um, People like getting together and very similar type. Everyone was on a similar wavelength and so on. So yeah, 3 spaces left on that one. And the next ones for April, which are not grow your own food, by the way, they will be announced over the coming week. Something else interesting, I started a beekeeping course 2 weeks ago, and yeah, really fascinating. It was bought for me as a present. Quite busy at the moment, so I wouldn't have chosen to do it at this stage of the year. But I find it really interesting. So just 2 weeks into a beginner's beekeeping course with Carlo beekeepers, and yeah, extremely interesting. Just hearing about bees, and it's fascinating how they operate and all the different things that they do. And yeah, it's really, really interesting and really enjoying it so far. So sewing, nice bit of sewing done, but weather's still a bit weird. We had a couple of lovely days earlier this week, followed by, day of wind, rain and snow. Um, so yeah, still a bit of a mixed bag. Looking at the max min thermometer in my polytunnel, huge fluctuations, highest temperatures, 27, 28 earlier in the week with all the sun, and nighttime temperatures quite cold, down to -1, heavy frost a couple of nights. So very, very mixed bag. And that's exactly what I was saying when we were talking about the sowing of seed. It's very inconsistent when you get sun and you get, as I say, snow on certain days here now, and warm days, cold days, and it's that fluctuation that we're trying to alleviate, and that's what seedlings don't like. It also, if you have seedlings that are getting a little bit more advanced, they're not going to love this temperature either. So, and this changes of weather. So they start growing and kind of pushing out leaf on those warm days, and then they're hit the next day with kind of hail and snow and so on. So this is the balancing act of starting earlier and having to mind seedlings going forward. But yeah, it's an interesting week weather-wise. But I've been tipping along. Haven't gone mad sewing yet because it's still, it felt 2 weeks ago like we were really up and running. But you just keep watching things. So I am sewing, but nice and gently so far. So that's been this week's episode. I hope it helps you in your decision to buy your greenhouse. Definitely a worthwhile investment. Definitely something you will use for years and years and years. give you such an advantage in terms of expansion of potential crops you can grow and expansion of season, both ends, starting and early, starting and later in the season. So it's really, really a really brilliant and worthwhile investment. And just hopefully what I've given you there will help you in your considerations to buying your greenhouse. And that's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening. And until the next time, happy gardening.